She thought it would be an ordinary delivery, but when they placed the baby on her chest and she lifted the blanket, the entire room froze. What the doctors saw defies explanation. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Evelyn had never imagined that the quiet street in Atlanta, with its slightly faded porches and patchy front lawns, would one day feel both like a cradle and a cage. She had lived there for nearly 10 years, long enough, it seemed, for the scent of the magnolia trees to etch itself into her skin and for the rhythm of the neighborhood to become as familiar as a heartbeat. Her two-story house, painted in a soft color that time had begun to mute, stood at the corner of the block. It had once been a place filled with laughter, plans, and the subtle comfort of knowing someone else was breathing beside her at night. Now it was a place where silence settled into every corner and every hallway, a silence that stretched painfully at dusk and clung to her even in sleep. She moved through that house with the tired grace of a woman who understood endurance too well. Her figure had changed over the months, her back curving slightly from the weight of pregnancy, her pace slowing as her feet swelled, but there was still something steady in her posture. Her dark eyes, though clouded by exhaustion, carried a gentleness that patients at the clinic trusted instantly. Her hands were the hands of a nurse who had soothed countless foreheads and held trembling palms, hands that had learned to remain calm even when everything else spun out of control. She wore practical clothes, loose cotton tops stretched over her growing stomach, worn sneakers that no longer cushioned the ache in her legs, and she tied her hair back in a way that suggested she no longer had the time or energy for vanity. She moved automatically, as though driven by a well-trained instinct that refused to falter no matter how heavy her body felt. Her days were shaped by the experiences that came with working in a busy medical clinic. She was the type of nurse who spoke little but noticed everything, the kind of woman who saw through bravado and fear alike. She would hurry down the corridors with charts pressed to her chest, answering calls, checking vitals, guiding frightened families through the worst days of their lives. Her colleagues respected her because she never raised her voice and never turned away from the unpleasant parts of the job. Whenever there was a crisis, an unexpected collapse, a child struggling to breathe, a confused patient unable to speak, Evelyn would appear like a grounding force. Even now, heavy with pregnancy and worn thin, she remained reliable. Every shift drained her, but she persisted, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking always led her back to the same memory. A year earlier, the world she knew had collapsed with the force of a single knock on the door. Before that evening, she had had a life that felt solid, shaped largely by her husband, Marcus. He had been a man of quiet humor and steady hands, a mechanic who took pride in repairing more than he broke, a father whose presence filled their home with a calm she did not realize she depended on until it was gone. He had loved music, always humming under his breath while he worked. He had loved his daughter, Nora, a little girl who followed him around the house like a shadow. And he had loved Evelyn with a tenderness that seemed endless and uncomplicated. Their life had not been glamorous, but it had been stable, threaded with plans for the future and little joys too small to be noticed until they disappeared. The night he died had begun like any other. He had kissed her forehead before leaving for a late shift, promising to bring home her favorite snacks from the convenience store. She remembered laughing and telling him not to. She remembered how warm his hand felt when he squeezed hers. She remembered the sound of the door closing. She remembered, too vividly, the way the world broke open when the police appeared hours later, faces solemn, voices gentle but firm. She remembered the way the room tilted, how her legs gave out beneath her, how she clutched her stomach, already carrying a life she had not yet discovered. The funeral had been a blur of hands, tears, and murmured condolences. Her mind had floated above her body, disconnected from everything except the unbearable truth that the man she loved would never walk through their door again. In the months after his death, grief settled into her like a second skin. She cried silently at night, pressing her pillow against her mouth so Nora would not hear. Every corner of the house seemed to echo with his absence. His tools in the garage, the dent in the sofa cushion where he used to sit, the coffee mug he used every morning, all of it weighed on her, reminders of a life that had ended too soon. But grief had no mercy for the exhausted, and she had a 6-year-old daughter who still needed lunchboxes packed, hair braided, fears calmed, and childhood preserved. Nora was a quiet child with big, searching eyes and a soft voice, a little girl who sensed emotions more than she understood them. She would ask about her father in short bursts, questions that caught Evelyn off guard when she least expected them. Where was he now? Why couldn't he come back? Did he still love her? Each question was a needle, slipping into the cracks of Evelyn's heart, but she answered honestly, hating the way the truth tasted on her tongue. They developed their own rituals to survive the grief. Nora would help set the table for dinner, her tiny hands placing forks unevenly but proudly. They would read stories at night, with Nora curling into her side as if searching for the warmth that was missing. Sometimes they laughed. Little, fragile laughs that reminded Evelyn that life still had pieces to offer. But every joy was accompanied by a shadow. Every quiet moment reminded her of everything that had been lost. When she discovered the pregnancy, it was early morning, and she had been too exhausted to think clearly. She had assumed her irregular cycles were the result of stress, but the symptoms grew too obvious to ignore. The test she took in the bathroom displayed its answer within seconds, and she sat on the edge of the bathtub, the plastic stick trembling in her fingers. It felt as though the world had tilted again. The doctor confirmed it later that afternoon, speaking gently, perhaps recognizing the fragile state Evelyn was in. The child she carried was Marcus's child, conceived before the accident, a final echo of the life they had shared. She walked out of the clinic in a daze, her throat tight and dry. Her first instinct had been panic. She could barely manage her grief and her job, let alone another child. She worried about money, about time, about how she could possibly love a new baby without feeling disloyal to the memory of the man she had lost. But, as the days passed, her panic shifted into something else. A recognition that this unborn child was the last piece of Marcus left in the world. That thought became both an anchor and a wound. She decided she would keep the baby, even if it terrified her. She told Nora gently, explaining that soon she would be a big sister. The little girl's reaction was a mix of excitement and fear, her eyes bright but uncertain. Evelyn hugged her tightly, reassuring her that nothing would change between them, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. The pregnancy was difficult from the beginning. She struggled through her shifts at the clinic, nausea twisting her stomach, headaches pressing behind her eyes. She would excuse herself to the staff bathroom to breathe through a wave of dizziness, gripping the sink for balance. Her co-workers noticed her fatigue, but not the depth of it. They offered to swap shifts occasionally, but the clinic was understaffed, and she rarely found the luxury of rest. Money was tight, so she pushed herself harder than she should have. She took on extra hours when she could, telling herself it was temporary, that once the baby came, she would find a way to manage. Doctor appointments became a steady rhythm in her life. Most were uneventful. The ultrasounds displayed a single child moving quietly in the womb. The doctor never expressed concern beyond the usual recommendations for a woman her age. Rest more, drink water, avoid stress, advice she tried to follow but rarely managed. She trusted the ultrasounds because she had no reason not to. One child, one heartbeat, one future she tried to prepare herself for. She bought clothes and blankets carefully, choosing neutral colors because she wanted the baby's world to feel calm when it arrived. She rearranged a corner of the house for a crib and a small changing table. Nora helped fold tiny outfits, her excitement growing as the due date approached. She would place her hand on her mother's belly and giggle when she felt a kick, her eyes widening with wonder. Yet, despite all her efforts, a weight of unease simmered under Evelyn's ribs. She told herself it was normal, that every mother felt this mixture of anticipation and dread. But late at night, lying in her bed with her hands resting over her stomach, she could feel a heaviness she could not quite explain. It was physical, of course, but also something more abstract. A sense that something important waited just beyond her understanding. As the final weeks of pregnancy approached, she moved slower, breathed heavier, and felt each day blur into the next. The house, once too big and too quiet, now felt crowded with preparations. She stood often in the doorway of the baby's corner, imagining how life would change once the child arrived. She pictured holding it, comforting it, feeding it in the middle of the night. She imagined the challenges, the sleeplessness, the moments when she would doubt herself. But she also imagined the sweetness, a tiny hand gripping her finger, the warmth of a small body against hers. She imagined Marcus, too, standing beside her, smiling proudly as he touched the baby's cheek. That vision made her eyes sting every time. The night before everything changed, she sat in the living room, one hand stroking her belly as she listened to Nora's soft breathing from the next room. The air felt heavy, as though the house itself was bracing for something. She whispered a few quiet words to the child inside her, telling it she would do her best no matter what came next. And as she turned off the light and began the slow walk toward her bedroom, she felt a strange, deep pressure settle low in her abdomen, a sensation that told her the journey ahead was about to shift in ways she could not yet imagine. In the weeks that followed, the shifting pressure in Evelyn's lower abdomen became a constant reminder that the moment she had been both dreading and anticipating was drawing near. Her belly had grown heavier than she remembered from her pregnancy with Nora, stretching her skin tight across a shape that seemed to change every few hours. Each morning, she woke feeling as though gravity had crept closer during the night, pulling her downward with a force that made her joints ache. Even simple tasks like bending to pick up a dropped spoon or reaching overhead to put away dishes felt monumental. Her pace slowed further, and she found herself pausing more often to catch her breath as she moved through the house. Still, she pushed forward because mothers didn't get to stop, and mothers like her never believed they deserved to. The neighborhood moved around her in its own familiar rhythm. Cars hummed past, children ran down the sidewalks yelling to one another, and dogs barked from fenced yards. But Evelyn felt increasingly distant from all of it, as though she were inhabiting a separate world where the air was denser and every sound filtered through a haze. Her mother called frequently, offering advice and reminders, always ending with a note of concern that Evelyn tried to brush aside. Her younger sister visited twice a week, bringing groceries or folding laundry, joking about how Evelyn should be relaxing with her feet up. But relaxation never came easily to Evelyn, not since Marcus died. Her mind always raced, calculating bills, thinking about meals, planning her shifts, worrying about Nora's emotional well-being. Pregnancy only made those worries multiply. Her final trimester crept forward with relentless slowness. Nights became especially difficult. She struggled to find a comfortable position, shuffling from her bed to the couch and back again, propping herself on pillows until the sheet beneath her felt twisted beyond repair. She would lie awake, listening to the distant sounds of the city, the occasional siren or barking dog or passing truck, her hand resting protectively over her belly. Sometimes she dozed off in mid-thought, only to wake minutes later with her back screaming and her breath shallow. Fatigue was no longer something she felt at the end of the day. It settled into her bones and stayed there from dawn to dusk. Nora watched all of this with a maturity that startled Evelyn. The little girl shadowed her mother's movements, always observing, always sensing when something wasn't right. She would bring her mother a blanket when she saw her shivering or offer her a cup of water when she noticed Evelyn rubbing her temples. She tried to make her laugh with silly drawings or awkward little dances she invented on the spot. But there were moments when her small shoulders drooped and her brows knitted together, moments when the weight of her mother's exhaustion made her eyes cloud with confusion. She wasn't old enough to understand everything, but she was old enough to feel the heaviness in the air. At the clinic, her coworkers stepped in where they could. One of the senior nurses insisted she take longer breaks, slipping into Evelyn's role whenever the line of patients grew too long. Another kept stashing snacks in her locker, nuts, fruit cups, granola bars, with notes that read, "Remember to eat or fuel for superheroes." Evelyn appreciated the kindness, but she hated being the source of concern. She had always been the one people relied on, the steady pair of hands in chaos. Becoming the person who needed help made her uneasy, and yet, deep inside, she knew she needed every bit of their support if she was going to make it to the end of this pregnancy without collapsing. Doctor visits in the final weeks became more frequent. She sat in the waiting room surrounded by other women, some chatting with their partners, others scrolling on their phones, all of them carrying the same unspoken mixture of fear and anticipation. When her name was called, she would rise slowly, pressing her hand into the small of her back as she followed the nurse down the hallway. The exams were routine. Blood pressure, weight, measurements, the steady swoosh of the fetal heartbeat echoing through the small room. The doctor never seemed alarmed. He would smile politely, tell her she was progressing as expected, and remind her that the final stretch was always the hardest. There was never any indication that something unusual lay ahead. The ultrasounds continued to show a single child, though sometimes the image was blurry or partially obstructed. Evelyn chalked it up to the baby's position and the crowdedness of late pregnancy. She trusted the medical professionals. She had no reason to suspect that anything had been missed. But her intuition stirred more insistently as the days went on. Her belly felt unusually taut, as though there was more pressure inside than there should be. She dismissed the thoughts, telling herself she was imagining things. Every pregnancy was different. Every baby grew differently. She forced herself not to dwell on the strange sense of fullness that didn't feel quite the same as it had when she was pregnant with Nora. She had too many other things to worry about: finances, childcare, the fear of raising 2 children alone, that she pushed aside every instinct that whispered to her in the dark hours of the night. One late afternoon, while folding laundry, she paused mid-motion, one hand pressed against her belly as a sharp pain shot through her. It lasted only a second, a brief electric jolt, but left her breathless. She stood still for a long moment, waiting, listening to her body. When nothing else occurred, she shook it off and continued with her chores. But as the evening settled and shadows grew long across the living room floor, the sensation returned. This time, it lingered. It wasn't intense enough to make her cry out, but it was wrong, deeper and more unsettling than the usual contractions she had been warned to expect. She lowered herself onto the sofa, rubbing slow circles over her abdomen, whispering reassurance to the child inside her. The pain ebbed away again, leaving her uncertain whether she should be alarmed or calm. Dinner that night was a quiet affair. Nora chatted happily about a drawing she had made in school, oblivious to the tension in her mother's face. Evelyn nodded and smiled, trying to focus, but her mind drifted repeatedly to the discomfort simmering beneath her ribs. After she put Nora to bed and kissed her forehead, Evelyn lingered in the doorway, watching her daughter settle under the blankets. There was an ache behind her eyes that had nothing to do with exhaustion. She whispered a soft good night and stepped into the hallway, leaning against the wall for support. That was when the real pain began. It came without warning, a twisting, crushing force that knocked the breath from her lungs. She doubled over, clutching her stomach, her knees buckling beneath her. For a moment, she thought she might faint. She lowered herself to the floor, trembling, gasping as another wave rose and crested inside her. It was nothing like the earlier pains. It was raw, overwhelming, and it made her heart race in panic. She tried to reach for her phone on the side table, but it felt impossibly far. The room swayed, shadows bending and stretching as her vision blurred. She forced herself to crawl, dragging her body inch by inch toward the table. Her fingers brushed the edge, then slipped. She swallowed a cry and tried again, nails scraping against the wood until finally she managed to pull the phone into her shaking hands. Her breath came in shallow bursts as she tapped the emergency number, her voice breaking as she tried to answer the operator's questions. The sound of Nora stirring in the next room made her throat tighten. She whispered her daughter's name, but she didn't want to scare her. Didn't want her little girl to witness the terror unfolding in the living room. When the paramedics arrived, their voices cut through the fog of pain. They moved quickly, lifting her onto the stretcher, fastening straps with swift precision, asking her questions she could barely answer. One of them glanced toward the hallway where Nora peeked out with wide, frightened eyes. A neighbor who had seen the ambulance lights approached and gently took the child's hand, promising to stay with her until Evelyn's family arrived. Through the haze, Evelyn felt a surge of gratitude mixed with guilt. She wished she could tell Nora everything would be fine, but the pain swallowed her words before they could form. The ambulance ride was a blur of flashing lights and clipped medical instructions. The paramedics monitored her vital signs, murmuring to one another with tones that suggested urgency, but not panic. Evelyn drifted in and out of awareness, focusing on the rise and fall of her breath as the contractions tightened around her like a vice. The siren cut through the night, echoing against the buildings, carrying her closer to the moment she had been both anticipating and fearing. At the hospital, she was wheeled through the bright hallways, past nurses who moved with the fluid efficiency of practiced routine. They checked her vitals, positioned her on the bed, adjusted the monitors, and prepared for what might be the start of active labor. A doctor examined her quickly, his expression focused, his questions direct but calm. He told her that the contractions were strong, that her body seemed ready, and that they would keep her under close observation until they could determine how fast things were progressing. Her mind swam with the pain and the weight of the moment. She tried to remember her breathing exercises, but every attempt felt shallow and forced. Hours passed in a haze of dim lights, muffled voices, and the persistent beeping of machines. Nurses came and went, adjusting her IV, monitoring the fetal heartbeat, checking her dilation. The contractions continued, sometimes easing enough for her to drift into a restless half-sleep, other times wrenching through her with such force that she clawed at the sheets. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and warm blankets, and the fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, casting fleeting shadows across the walls. She felt suspended in time, unable to move forward or backward, trapped in the relentless cycle of her own body preparing to bring a child into the world. In the darkest hours before dawn, the uncertainty settled over her like a heavy blanket. She could hear whispers outside her door, nurses communicating in low tones that she couldn't quite decipher. Their footsteps echoed and faded, leaving her alone with the persistent hum of the machines. She stared at the ceiling, her mind drifting between fear and exhaustion, wondering whether the unease in her chest was a sign that something was wrong, or simply the natural fear of childbirth, magnified by grief and loneliness. She wished Marcus were there, holding her hand, grounding her. The empty space beside her felt colder than ever. When a contraction finally eased enough for her to breathe without grimacing, she closed her eyes and tried to steady herself. She told the baby inside her that they would get through this. She whispered promises of love and protection, though her voice was thin and trembling. She felt the weight of the pregnancy pressing into her pelvis, a growing certainty that the moment of birth was approaching faster than she could fully comprehend. And still, a small voice inside her murmured that something about this night was different, something the ultrasounds and doctors had not revealed. But she pushed the thought aside, clinging instead to the hope that by morning she would be holding her child, that everything would become clear, and that this long, painful journey would finally lead her into a new chapter she could survive. She did not yet know that the truth waiting for her on the other side of labor would rewrite everything she understood about this pregnancy, this night, and the life she believed was unfolding before her. The night bled slowly into morning, though Evelyn had no sense of how many hours had passed since she first arrived at the hospital. Time had dissolved into a distorted sequence of rising contractions, labored breaths, and fleeting moments of disorientation. She drifted in and out of awareness, her mind like a candle flickering against an unrelenting wind. Nurses adjusted the monitors around her, their silhouettes moving with practiced precision. Voices came to her like echoes underwater, distant and warped, making it hard to distinguish instructions from reassurances. Though she tried to hold on to consciousness, her thoughts kept slipping, pulled back into the fog of exhaustion. As dawn approached, the contractions grew stronger, no longer spaced apart by moments of manageable discomfort. Each one rose from deep within her, rolling upward like a tide determined to break her open. She clutched the bed rails, sweat collecting at her temples and trickling down the sides of her face. There were moments when she felt as though she were floating outside her own body, watching herself from a distance as she struggled and strained. Pain had become a language her body spoke fluently, though her mind could no longer translate it into anything coherent. Every muscle trembled, and even breathing felt like an impossible task. She wanted Marcus. She wanted his steady hand, his calm voice, his presence that once anchored her. But that longing only made the room feel emptier. The doctor entered again, checking her dilation with a measured calm that contrasted sharply with the turmoil she felt. He exchanged glances with the nurses, subtle but not subtle enough to escape her notice. She could read tension in those looks, a tension that didn't match their words. They told her she was progressing, that her body was doing what it needed to do, but their eyes told a different story. There was something else happening beneath the surface, something they were not ready to voice. She wanted to ask, to demand answers, but each attempt dissolved into a gasp or a cry as another contraction seized her. The monitors beside her bed beeped steadily, but the pattern of the fetal heartbeat shifted periodically, dipping in ways that made the doctor lean in, adjust the sensors, and press them more firmly against her belly. Sometimes the sound was strong and clear, while other times it seemed to fade, replaced by static or a faint, fluttering rhythm that made the doctor's brow furrow before he quickly masked his expression. He reassured her that babies often moved during labor, that the dips were normal in the final stages. But Evelyn could sense he did not entirely believe his own words. Her instincts sharpened, even through the haze of pain. Something wasn't right, though she had no language for this feeling, no way to grasp the shape of the wrongness she sensed. The contractions intensified as morning light seeped through the blinds, painting thin, pale stripes across the floor. She gripped the bed rail so tightly her knuckles blanched. Her breathing came in ragged bursts, her chest rising and falling with uneven rhythm. The nurses encouraged her to breathe deeply, to focus, to let her body lead the way, but she felt as though she were sinking into quicksand, her strength pulling farther away with each wave. Her heart pounded against her ribs, sweat drenching the gown that clung to her skin. Still, she pushed through each wave, because stopping was never an option. Not for her, not for the child who depended on her. The doctor gave instructions she barely heard, though she followed them instinctively. Her body had taken over, acting on impulses older than language. She bore down with each contraction, feeling her muscles tighten and release in strenuous rhythm. Nurses murmured encouragement, adjusting the lights, checking instruments, positioning themselves for the moment of delivery. The room was filled with movement and urgency, but beneath it all ran an undercurrent of unease, subtle but persistent. Hours blurred until at last the contractions reached a peak that felt unbearable. Her body shook with effort. She cried out, her voice cracking under the strain. Then, with a surge of pressure and pain, unlike anything she had felt before, the first child entered the world. She felt the sudden shift inside her, the abrupt release of tension, followed by an overwhelming flood of relief that washed over her so completely she nearly collapsed back against the pillows. A faint, soft cry filled the room, weak but real. Her eyes fluttered open, searching the faces around her for reassurance. One of the nurses quickly took the infant to a warming station, suctioning fluid from the baby's nose and checking its breathing while speaking in calm, measured tones. Evelyn blinked heavily, trying to focus, but her vision was blurred with sweat and tears. The doctor leaned over her, checking her again with careful hands. She expected to hear the usual words, that she had done it, that it was over, but he didn't say them. Instead, his expression shifted, a flicker of something passing through his eyes. He pressed gently along her abdomen, his movements slowing as he encountered a resistance he hadn't expected. She sensed his concern before he voiced it in a low, steady tone meant to hide the tremor beneath. Her body had not finished. There was still pressure inside her, a lingering fullness that wasn't supposed to remain now that the baby had been delivered. She tried to speak, to ask what was happening, But another contraction slammed through her with such force that she arched off the bed, grabbing at the sheets. The doctor stepped back, surprised by the intensity. The nurses exchanged glances, hurriedly repositioning themselves for what none of them had anticipated. The room shifted from the calm that follows a birth to a rapid, simmering urgency. The doctor signaled for additional equipment, his voice clipped but controlled. He returned to Evelyn's side, explaining that sometimes the body needed more time to pass remaining tissue, that contractions could continue briefly after birth. But the words sounded thin, as though they were being stretched to cover something larger. The contractions didn't slow. In fact, they intensified again, rolling through her with ferocity that made her gasp and groan. She could hardly understand what her body was doing. She had expected relief, not a second storm. Her mind spun as she tried to make sense of the chaos. She felt pressure pushing downward, an unmistakable heaviness. It didn't feel like afterbirth. It felt like another child. The thought flashed through her mind like lightning, but she rejected it immediately. It couldn't be. The doctor had seen only one child on every ultrasound. There had been no indication, no hint. And yet her body told a different story, one that contradicted everything she had been told for the past 9 months. The doctor's expression grew grimly focused. He instructed her to push again when the next contraction came. She stared at him, confusion and fear flooding her eyes, but she nodded weakly, unable to argue with the certainty she now felt. When the contraction came, she bore down with every shred of strength left in her. The room tilted, lights blurring, voices rising in a flurry of instruction and tension. Another wave followed, and another, each drawing more from her than she thought she possessed. Then, with a final wrenching push, she felt a shift inside her that matched the first birth almost perfectly. The second child arrived, slipping into the doctor's hands in a moment that stunned the entire room into silence. For a moment, no one moved. The doctor steadied himself, processing what had just happened. The nurses froze, their eyes wide. The air crackled with disbelief. Evelyn lay trembling, her chest heaving as she tried to comprehend what she had just done. 2 children. She had given birth to 2 children when she had been told, repeatedly, that there was only one. The baby released a small, sharper cry than the first, its voice stronger, filling the room with the clarity that had been missing moments earlier. The sound broke the spell, and the nurses sprang into motion. One lifted the second newborn, cradling it gently while checking its breathing. Another continued tending to the first child, who now rested under the warm glow of the overhead bulb, wrapped in a soft blanket. The doctor exhaled shakily, wiping his forehead before turning back to Evelyn. His voice was soft when he finally spoke, tinged with astonishment. He admitted they had delivered twins, that somehow one twin had remained hidden behind the other throughout the pregnancy, shielded by its sibling and positioned in such a way that even the ultrasounds had failed to detect it. Explanations followed in fragments: rare phenomenon, unusual fetal positioning, limitations of imaging late in pregnancy. The medical staff tried to sound composed, but the shock in their eyes betrayed them. Evelyn listened, barely able to process their words. She felt dazed, as though she were floating between realities. Her body trembled uncontrollably, the effort of delivering 2 babies back to back leaving her utterly depleted. She could feel tears slipping down her temples, though she wasn't sure if they were from fear, relief, confusion, or some mixture of all 3. The doctor assured her that both babies were alive, that their vital signs looked stable, that the hospital team would continue monitoring them closely. Nurses adjusted her blankets, changed out equipment, and checked her vitals repeatedly. Yet, even as they surrounded her with care, Evelyn felt an eerie detachment, as though she were watching the scene unfold from the corner of the ceiling, observing a version of herself who had stepped into a narrative she hadn't known she was living. She tried to turn her head toward the warming stations where her children lay, but her body felt too heavy to move. Still, she could see the faint outlines of their tiny forms under the soft lights, the delicate limbs, the round cheeks, the tiny fists curled against their bodies. 2 children, born minutes apart. Children she hadn't known she was carrying. Children who now connected her to Marcus in ways she had not imagined possible. The nurses approached her slowly, their expressions gentle, as though they feared one wrong word might shatter her. They reassured her again that both babies were doing well. They asked if she needed water, pain relief, or a moment to rest before seeing them up close. She nodded weakly, her throat too tight to speak. A strange calm washed over her, fragile but real, replacing the panic with a quiet, stunned wonder. Outside her room, she heard footsteps and muted voices, staff discussing the unusual case, preparing the necessary documentation, perhaps marveling among themselves about the unpredictability of childbirth. Inside, the room felt both crowded and impossibly empty, filled with machines and medical personnel, yet hollowed out by the enormity of what had just occurred. As the doctor left to update the chart and alert the pediatric team, Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment. She felt the throb and ache of her muscles, the heaviness of her limbs, the overwhelming fatigue settling into every cell. But beneath all of that ran something else, a sense of anticipation that had not been there before. A recognition that whatever awaited her next, she was no longer the mother of one child. She was the mother of twins. Twins whose arrival had rewritten every assumption she had made about her future, her grief, her strength, and her connection to the man she had lost. She inhaled shakily, letting the reality settle around her like a shroud. The beginning of the truth had only just revealed itself. The full weight of it would come soon, wrapped in blankets and placed gently into her arms. The quiet after the storm of labor felt almost unreal. For a long moment, Evelyn lay still, suspended between exhaustion and disbelief, her breath shallow as her mind tried to comprehend what her body had just done. The room around her hummed with soft mechanical sounds, the rhythmic beeping of monitors, the gentle murmur of nurses updating charts or adjusting the lighting. But beneath these familiar hospital noises lingered an unusual tension, a collective sense of anticipation and uncertainty that filled the air like a dense fog. Even through her haze, she could feel it settling over her, wrapping itself around every movement and every silence in the room. Her body throbbed with a deep, pulsing ache that radiated through her hips and abdomen, a reminder of the extraordinary physical toll she had just endured. But the ache felt secondary, almost distant compared to the swirl of emotions rising inside her. She could hear the occasional soft cry of one of the babies, tiny, fragile sounds that cut through the fog like a beacon. The noise tugged at her attention, stirring something primal and irresistible. She tried to lift her head, but her neck felt as heavy as stone. For a moment, she simply lay there, breathing, gathering strength, letting the reality seep into her bones. Twins. She had delivered twins. The word itself felt strange, foreign, almost impossible. Twins belonged to other people's stories, shared over coffee tables or recounted in fascination on social media. They were something one prepared for. Double strollers, double cribs, double expectations. They were a journey anticipated, planned, discussed for months. But for Evelyn, it had arrived unannounced, emerging from the depths of her body like a secret revealed too late for preparation. The shock had left her trembling, not from fear alone, but from the sheer magnitude of what it meant. She was now the mother of 3 children, a single parent responsible for not one newborn, but 2. As she lay there, breathing through the weight of that realization, the doctor returned. His footsteps were slow, measured, as though he himself still carried the astonishment of what had happened. He approached her bedside cautiously, his voice soft when he spoke. He explained again that it was an exceedingly rare occurrence. One baby hiding the presence of the other, shielded behind its sibling's position, tucked deep in a pocket of her womb where the ultrasounds had failed to catch it. The way he described it made it sound like a trick of nature, a moment where biology outmaneuvered machinery, where life insisted on its own mystery. She listened, eyes half open, trying to wrap her mind around the explanation. It still felt unreal, like a plot twist in someone else's life. The doctor excused himself, leaving her with a gentle reassurance that the staff would bring the babies to her soon. She watched him disappear beyond the curtain and felt the weight of the room settle once more. A nurse approached her bed with a stack of warm blankets, adjusting the sheet beneath her and tucking the edges around her legs. The warmth helped soothe her trembling limbs, but her heart still beat irregularly, skipping in uncertainty between amazement and fear. She wanted to hold her children, to see their faces, to understand who they were. The thought of them, 2 small lives she had unknowingly nurtured, filled her with a desperate longing. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours, each one stretching painfully into the next. The faint cries continued intermittently, rising from the warming stations where her newborns lay. The nurses moved around them gently, checking temperatures, adjusting blankets, speaking softly to one another as they verified every vital sign. Their faces were lit with a mixture of concentration and wonder. Evelyn watched them through her half-lidded eyes, observing the way they handled the babies with a reverence that surpassed routine. Even the staff seemed stunned into a quiet awe by the unexpected arrival of twins. At last, the doctor returned, this time accompanied by 2 nurses who held the babies carefully in their arms. The first nurse approached her with a gentle smile, though her eyes reflected the same astonished tenderness that everyone else seemed to share. She lowered the baby into Evelyn's arms with slow, deliberate movements, as though passing a fragile treasure. The weight of the child settled against Evelyn's chest, warm and soft, and the moment their skin touched, a rush of emotion swept through her. Relief, fear, love, disbelief, all blending into something too powerful to name. Before she could truly process the presence of the first baby, the second nurse stepped forward, holding out the other newborn wrapped in a similar hospital blanket. The baby's small face peeked out timidly from the folds of fabric, and Evelyn felt another sharp burst of emotion as she reached for the child. The nurses helped position both infants safely in her arms, one nestled along each side of her body like halves of a whole she had not known existed. The weight of them was overwhelming. Each was so small, their breaths shallow and rapid, their bodies curled instinctively into tiny bundles. Evelyn looked down at them, her vision blurring with tears she hadn't realized she'd been holding back. Her breath hitched as she studied their faces, one rounder, with her own nose and the delicate shape of her mouth, the other bearing features that made her chest constrict with an ache far deeper than physical exhaustion. The second baby's face was uncannily familiar. The curve of the cheek, the subtle angle of the eyebrows, the way the lips pressed together even in sleep. It was like looking at Marcus's face in miniature, recreated with startling accuracy. Her heart clenched. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. The room seemed to tilt slightly, though she knew it was her own emotional center shifting under the weight of recognition. She brushed her fingers across the baby's tiny forehead, barely daring to touch, as though afraid the child might vanish if she acknowledged the resemblance too openly. The baby stirred slightly at her touch, its small mouth opening in a soft pout, and she felt a rush of warmth flood her limbs. It was as though a piece of Marcus had returned to her, carried into the world by a force beyond understanding. A second chance she had never expected, could never have hoped for. The baby nestled against her chest, warm and real, and Evelyn felt a sob rise from deep within her. She tried to swallow it back, but her throat tightened, her chin trembled, and tears spilled over her lashes despite her efforts. She held them close, both children, one on each side, and let the tears fall silently, her body shaking with the release of months of grief, fear, uncertainty, and now overwhelming revelation. The babies squirmed gently, their tiny fists brushing against her skin, their breaths synchronizing with her own. They seemed to sense the shift in her emotions, their small bodies responding instinctively to the presence of their mother. The nurses, standing nearby, watched with quiet sympathy. They said nothing, giving her space to absorb the moment. The doctor had stepped back toward the doorway, speaking softly with someone in the hall, but Evelyn barely noticed. All she could see were the two small faces resting against her, one carrying her reflection, the other carrying the ghost of the man she had loved more deeply than she knew how to express. After a long, suspended moment, a nurse returned to check on her, adjusting her pillows so that she could support the weight of both babies more comfortably. She asked if Evelyn felt stable, if she needed water, if she needed help repositioning them. Evelyn shook her head weakly, though her arms trembled with effort. She didn't want to let go. She feared that if she released them, even for a moment, the tenuous thread connecting her to this impossible revelation would snap. But exhaustion eventually forced her to loosen her grip. The nurses gently took the babies back, placing them in the portable bassinets beside her bed where she could see them clearly. Their faces relaxed into peaceful sleep, lips puckered slightly, tiny chests rising and falling with the rapid rhythm of newborns. Evelyn lay back against the pillows, watching them with eyes that refused to blink. The resemblance to Marcus was unmistakable in one, the connection immediate and powerful. As she tried to process the enormity of the moment, her exhaustion deepened, but her mind refused to rest. Everything she thought she knew about her pregnancy had been uprooted. The months of fear and preparation had been based on the belief she was bringing one child into the world, but life had decided otherwise. Life had given her two. She felt torn between wonder and dread. Twins meant double the responsibility, double the needs, double the sleepless nights. But it also meant double the love, double the laughter, double the future she had begun to believe she wouldn't have. She exhaled slowly, tears drying on her cheeks. Her body still throbbed with pain, but her heart felt fuller than it had in years. She closed her eyes briefly, trying to steady her breath, drawing strength from the tiny breaths rising from the bassinets. When she opened her eyes again, she felt a quiet knowing settle inside her. She hadn't been prepared for twins, but she would rise to meet this new reality, just as she had risen to meet every impossible challenge since Marcus's death. The door opened then, and soft footsteps approached. Evelyn looked up to see her mother and sister standing in the doorway, frozen mid-step as their gazes fell upon the bassinets. Their expressions shifted instantly. First confusion, then shock, then a dawning comprehension that washed over their faces like sunlight breaking through clouds. They glanced at each other, overwhelmed, before hurrying inside, their voices soft and breathless as they tried to piece together the story unfolding before them. She watched their reactions, her heart fluttering as they approached the babies with disbelief written clearly across their features. They whispered in awe, hands covering their mouths, eyes filling with tears as they realized the truth. One of the babies, the one who looked so perfectly like Marcus, drew their focus as though magnetized. Her mother's voice broke as she murmured that she could see him clearly, the son-in-law she had lost, resurrected in the face of this tiny child. Evelyn felt her throat tighten again, her emotions raw and vulnerable. But this time she did not feel alone in her astonishment or her grief. Her family stood beside her, their reactions mirroring her own inner turmoil. They too saw the significance of this moment. They too felt the past and the future, converging in the faces of these newborns. And as the room filled with whispered awe, trembling joy, and the fresh cries of new life, Evelyn understood that the story she thought she had been living had transformed completely. The arrival of her twins marked not just the end of labor, but the beginning of something profound, something layered with meaning, mystery, and the legacy of a man she had loved so deeply that even death had not fully taken him from her. The room had begun to shift from the shocked stillness of the first moments into a soft murmur of voices and quiet, trembling breaths. Evelyn's mother and sister stood near the bassinets, their hands hovering just above the babies, as though afraid to touch something so delicate, so extraordinary. Her mother's eyes glistened with tears, the kind that came from joy and sorrow, mingling so closely that they became indistinguishable. Her sister's hands trembled as she reached out, her fingertips barely brushing the edge of a blanket, unable to believe that two children had entered the world where only one had been expected. Their astonishment seemed to fold itself around the room like a second layer of air, thick with emotions that hadn't yet settled into words. Evelyn watched them from her bed, her body too weak to rise but her heart stretching outward as though trying to catch each moment before it slipped away. She could feel the aftershocks of the deliveries trembling through her limbs, a deep exhaustion settling into her bones, but her mind remained acutely alert, absorbing the expressions on her family's faces, the way they shifted from disbelief to wonder to a kind of reverence. Her mother covered her mouth with her hand, shoulders shaking as tears streamed down her cheeks. Her sister knelt beside the bassinets, whispering something too soft for Evelyn to hear, something that made her own throat tighten with unspoken feelings. The baby, who resembled Marcus, seemed to draw them in most irresistibly. It wasn't just the similarity. It was the uncanny, heart-wrenching familiarity, as though time had folded and brought forward a tiny reflection of the man they all had loved. Her mother stared at the baby for a long moment, her expression shifting between grief and awe. She reached out with trembling fingers to brush the child's cheek, barely making contact, as though afraid the moment might shatter. When her fingers finally touched the soft warmth of the infant's skin, a sound escaped her, a quiet sob that filled the small room with a depth Evelyn had not heard from her since Marcus's funeral. Her mother turned toward her then, eyes red but shining with something bright and indescribable. She moved to Evelyn's bedside, taking her hand gently, her touch careful as though Evelyn might break, For a moment, they simply looked at one another, and in that look, an entire unspoken conversation unfolded. Shock at the unexpected miracle, grief for the man who was not there to witness it, and an overwhelming sense of gratitude that life had brought forth this impossible continuation of him. Evelyn felt her own tears gather once more, blurring her mother's features until she could barely see. Her sister joined them, leaning over the bed to embrace her gently, mindful of her fragile state. She murmured something soothing, though Evelyn could hardly hear the words over the pounding of her heart. She had not anticipated this outpouring of emotion, not from them, not from herself. She had endured the pregnancy alone, had carried the weight of fear and responsibility in silence, believing that her struggle was hers alone to bear. But now, seeing her family react with such depth and tenderness, she felt something inside herself begin to let go. It was as though the burden she had carried so long had shifted, redistributed among those who loved her, becoming a weight she no longer had to shoulder by herself. Her mother eventually returned to the bassinets, drawn once more to the faces of the newborns. Her gaze moved between the two babies, lingering on their tiny features, their soft breaths, the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of their little chests. It was impossible not to see the connection between them, born minutes apart, yet already seeming to sense the presence of the other, as though they had spent those hidden months not in isolation but intertwined in a silent, intimate world of their own. Her sister crouched beside her mother, brushing her hand softly along the edge of the blankets, her face filled with something luminous and tender. The door opened quietly then, and Nora entered the room, guided by a nurse who held her hand gently. Evelyn's breath caught. Her daughter stood small and hesitant in the doorway, her eyes wide as they scanned the room, taking in the unfamiliar machines, the soft lighting, the faces lined with emotion. She clutched a stuffed animal to her chest, the worn fabric of it dangling limply from her arm. Her gaze finally reached Evelyn, and she ran forward on small, careful feet, climbing into the side of the bed with the urgency only a child could summon. She wrapped her arms around her mother's arm, pressing her cheek against it, gathering comfort from the closeness she had been denied the night before. Evelyn kissed the top of her daughter's head, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, the warmth of her small body pressed against her side. She rested her hand gently on the child's back, feeling the way Nora's breaths came quickly, as though she had been afraid all night and only now allowed herself to relax. She whispered her name, her voice still hoarse, and Nora lifted her head slowly, eyes glistening with confusion. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Are you okay?" Evelyn nodded, though her strength was thin. She brushed a strand of hair from Nora's forehead and kissed her again, silently reassuring her. Then Nora's gaze shifted, drawn inexorably toward the bassinets. She stared for a long moment, processing the sight of not one, but two babies. Her small brows knitted together, her mouth parted in astonished silence. She slid off the bed and walked carefully toward them, her steps slow and deliberate, as though approaching something magical and fragile. Her grandmother and aunt stepped aside, giving her space. Her eyes moved between the babies, lingering on each face, as though trying to understand who they were and how they came to be. She reached out a tentative hand, drawing it back at the last moment, unsure if she was allowed to touch. Her grandmother placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, guiding her closer. "These are your brothers," she whispered softly. "Both of them." Nora blinked, her eyes widening even more. She turned to Evelyn with a mixture of wonder and uncertainty, as though needing confirmation. Evelyn nodded slowly, tears gathering again. She watched her daughter's face shift, shock melting into something softer, warmer, something like awe. Then, as though accepting this new reality all at once, Nora stretched out her hand again, this time resting it lightly on one baby's foot, her fingers trembling. The baby wriggled slightly under her touch, curling its toes. She giggled softly, then brought her hand to the other baby's tiny hand, and the room seemed to shift in that moment. Past, present, and future knitting themselves together around that small, tender gesture. Evelyn watched her daughter carefully, noting the flicker of hesitation that crossed her face as she studied the babies again. Nora's eyes held a shadow of something, the dawning realization that her world had changed. She was no longer the only child, no longer the sole focus of her mother's attention. There would be sharing now, compromise, adjustments she was still too young to fully comprehend, but mixed with that uncertainty was a flicker of pride, a sense of responsibility forming quietly, like a seed planted without her noticing. Her mother and sister moved closer then, surrounding the bassinets with soft murmurs and affectionate gestures. They spoke of helping Evelyn, of coming more frequently to support her with the twins and with Nora, discussing arrangements and possibilities in hushed tones. Evelyn listened, too exhausted to speak, but deeply moved by their support. For the first time in months, she didn't feel entirely alone. She felt surrounded by a safety net she had convinced herself she didn't have. As she lay back against her pillows, watching her family circle around her newborns, she felt the burden of grief for Marcus shift once more. It wasn't that the pain faded, it never would, but it changed shape, becoming softer, less jagged. The baby who bore his features seemed to embody something sacred, a continuation of him she hadn't dared to hope for. She felt his presence in the room, not a ghost, not a memory, but a warmth, a gentle weight that settled over her shoulders and filled her lungs. It was as though life had handed her a message. He had not left her entirely. Some part of him remained in these children, in their tiny expressions and their quiet breaths. The hours passed with a delicate rhythm, filled with awe and cautious joy. Nurses came and went, checking on Evelyn, checking on the twins, offering updates and reassurances. Her mother held one baby, while her sister held the other, their expressions softening with each passing minute. Nora stayed close, sometimes sitting on the edge of Evelyn's bed, sometimes standing beside the bassinets, absorbing slowly the new shape of her family. The room echoed with quiet voices, laughter mixed with tears, whispered promises of support. Evelyn drifted in and out of brief moments of rest, her body yearning for sleep but her mind unwilling to let go of the sight of her children. She had feared, after Marcus's death, that her family would never feel whole again. She had feared that she would spend the rest of her life trying to piece together remnants of a life that had shattered. But now, watching her mother rock a newborn gently, while her sister wiped tears from her cheeks, and watching Nora timidly touch the soft fingers of her little brothers, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It wasn't loud or triumphant. It was quiet, delicate, like the faint glow before sunrise. But it was real. She felt it settle inside her, warming the broken parts that had long gone cold. When evening approached and her family prepared to leave, promising to return in the morning, Evelyn was left alone with the twins once more, the room dim and peaceful. She stared at them, marveling at their tiny features, at their soft, steady breaths. She thought of the coming days, of the challenges that would surely overwhelm her at times, of the sleepless nights and the endless tasks. She thought of the financial strain, the logistics, the emotional toll, but she also thought of the laughter that would fill her home again, the moments of quiet closeness, the tiny milestones she would witness as her sons grew. She thought of Marcus, imagining how he would have held them, how he would have smiled, how he would have whispered their names with pride. Slowly, she reached out to touch the side of the bassinet where the baby who resembled him lay. Her fingers brushed his blanket, and tears rose once more, unbidden but welcome. She whispered a promise to him, soft enough that only she could hear it, a promise born of love, grief, and fierce determination. Then she whispered another to the second baby, whose face mirrored her own. She would raise them. She would protect them. She would give them everything she had left, and then more. As she lay back, her eyelids heavy, the final thought that drifted through her mind before sleep claimed her was simple and profound. Her family had not been reduced by loss. It had grown. The first pale light of morning seeped into the hospital room, filtering softly through the blinds and stretching across the floor in thin, warm lines. Evelyn stirred awake slowly, as though surfacing from a deep, underwater drift. Her body felt heavier than the night before, the lingering ache of labor still pulsing through her hips and lower abdomen. But there was a new quiet in her mind, a strange, delicate calm that had not existed for months. She blinked several times before her vision cleared, and the first thing she saw were the two bassinets pulled close to her bedside, each containing a tiny form bundled tightly in hospital blankets. For a moment, she simply stared, letting the sight anchor her to the present, letting the surreal become real. The twins slept in perfect stillness, their breaths small and rapid, their features softened by the warm glow of the room. They were so close that their blankets touched, the edges overlapping slightly, as though even in sleep they reached for each other. Evelyn's chest tightened at the sight. She shifted slowly, wincing as her body reminded her of everything it had endured. But she endured the discomfort because she needed, to sit up and take in every detail of the morning. She adjusted her pillow, bracing herself with the rails of the hospital bed, moving inch by inch until she could see them more clearly. Her eyes moved between them, studying their small faces. The baby, who resembled Marcus, looked peaceful, his features relaxed, his mouth slightly open. The resemblance was even stronger in the morning light, sharp enough to steal her breath. It was as though someone had gently placed Marcus's face in miniature right beside her, not to haunt her, but to remind her of something she had forgotten, something about continuity, about the persistence of love through time. She reached out and brushed a finger lightly across his cheek, marveling at the softness of his skin. He stirred only slightly, his tiny lips puckering before settling again. The other twin slept with one fist curled near his chin, his posture uncannily reminiscent of Nora as a baby. Evelyn saw her own features in him, the slope of the nose, the gentle curve of the jaw, the faint crease above the brow. It was like looking at a reflection of her younger self. She felt a different kind of tug in her heart, a familiar warmth that radiated through her chest. There was something grounding about seeing herself in him, something that reminded her she was not just a vessel of grief or responsibility. She was a person with her own lineage, her own story, and her children carried pieces of her forward just as surely as they carried Marcus. A soft knock interrupted the quiet, and a nurse entered with a warm smile. She moved with easy confidence to check the twins' monitors and examine Evelyn's chart. Her voice was gentle, respectful of the fragile calm that filled the room. She explained that the pediatric team would be conducting another examination later that morning, just to ensure both babies were adjusting well. Evelyn nodded, only half hearing, her attention returning repeatedly to the twins. The nurse reassured her that everything looked good so far. Heart rate steady, temperatures stable, reflexes normal. It was a comfort she hadn't realized she desperately needed. Once the nurse left, silence returned, but this time it felt comforting, as though the room had become a sacred cocoon where nothing rushed and nothing demanded. Evelyn let her head rest back against the pillow, feeling the weight of her eyelids but refusing to close them. She wanted to remain awake, to absorb every second. She knew the peace wouldn't last. Life, real life, waited beyond these walls, filled with challenges that already threatened to overwhelm her. But for now, in the safety of this quiet morning, she allowed herself to simply exist with her children, to breathe the same air, to memorize the shape of their faces and the rhythm of their breaths. The reverie was broken by the soft shuffle of small feet in the hallway. Nora entered hesitantly, clutching her stuffed animal. She pushed the door open carefully, her eyes darting toward her mother before she fully stepped inside. Evelyn smiled weakly, stretching out her hand. Nora hurried to her bedside, climbing up gently as though fearful of hurting her. She nestled close, placing her head near Evelyn's shoulder. Evelyn wrapped an arm around her daughter, feeling the familiar comfort of her warmth. "You're okay?" Nora whispered, her voice trembling in a way she tried to hide. Evelyn kissed the top of her head, nodding as she held her a little tighter. Then Nora's gaze drifted toward the bassinets again, and her body tensed slightly. This time, the confusion from yesterday had softened. What lingered now was a mix of fascination and uncertainty. She looked at the twins with wide eyes, absorbing the sight with a seriousness far beyond her years. Evelyn watched her carefully. She saw the conflict in her daughter, the struggle to understand her new role, the sudden shift from being an only child to having to share everything from this moment forward. She knew it wouldn't be easy for Nora. She knew there would be moments of jealousy, frustration, perhaps even resentment. But she also knew that Nora had a heart big enough to grow around her brothers if she was guided gently. "Do you want to see them?" Evelyn asked softly. Nora nodded. Evelyn shifted slightly, motioning her daughter closer to the bassinets. Nora approached with slow steps, standing between the two babies. She reached out her small hand tentatively, touching the blanket near the older twin's foot. The baby moved, wiggling his toes, and Nora let out a tiny gasp. Then she moved her hand toward the other twin, brushing the edge of his blanket. A smile flickered across her face. "They're small," she whispered. Evelyn nodded, watching the scene with a swelling heart. Her mother and sister arrived soon after, bringing warm breakfast, juice, and the familiar comfort of family. Her mother went immediately to the twins, checking their blankets, counting their breaths in that instinctive way only grandmothers could. Her sister busied herself preparing a small corner of the room for Nora, laying out crayons and paper, trying to help the child adjust to the long hours they would spend here. Evelyn found herself drifting in and out of sleep as the morning went on. Her family took turns holding the babies under the supervision of the nurses. Nora sat near her grandmother, showing her drawings of the twins, a pair of squiggly shapes with wide circles for eyes and tiny lines for limbs. Her grandmother laughed softly, praising every detail. Her sister stepped into the hall occasionally to make calls, arranging for meals, groceries, and errands, already assuming responsibilities in preparation for Evelyn's return home. By midday, the doctor returned for further evaluations. He explained the rare nature of the hidden twin, using diagrams and gentle explanations. He described how one baby's position could obscure the other, how fetal movement could shift everything, how equipment wasn't perfect. He also explained the genetic variation that could make one twin appear significantly more like one parent and the other more like the other, a natural, if uncommon, phenomenon. Everything he said was delivered with reassurance, with emphasis on the fact that both boys were healthy, that they were strong, that they had come through an unexpected birth remarkably well. Evelyn listened with her family gathered around her. Hearing the doctor's calm explanations allowed her to breathe more easily. She felt a quiet relief settle into her chest. The unknown had always been the scariest part of the journey, and having the unknown now explained, even partially, gave her a sense of clarity she hadn't realized she was craving. When her family left for the evening, promising to return early the next morning, Evelyn was again alone with her sons. The day had been long, filled with emotions that stretched her already fragile strength. Yet, despite the exhaustion, she found her mind racing ahead toward everything waiting outside the hospital. She thought of the house, the 2 cribs that needed to be set up, the clothes that needed to be sorted, the formula and diapers that would be needed in double quantities. She thought of the nights she would spend awake, feeding one child while the other cried, comforting one while the other slept. She thought of Nora's adjustment, her need for attention and reassurance. She thought of bills, schedules, childcare, her job. Each thought pressed into her until her chest felt tight. But then she looked at the twins again, at their peaceful faces, their sleeping forms, and the worries softened. She thought of how Nora had touched their blankets, how her mother had cried at the sight of them, how her sister had already stepped in to help. She thought of Marcus, and how one twin bore his face so clearly it was as though he had never fully left her. She thought of the weight of grief she had carried for so long and the strange, unexpected way life had offered her a fragment of healing she never expected. Evening settled slowly. The nurses dimmed the lights, leaving only a soft lamp glowing near her bed. The twins slept soundly, filling the room with a steady, comforting rhythm. Evelyn watched them until her eyes grew heavy, letting herself be pulled toward sleep by the gentle lull of their breathing. As she drifted, she felt the first threads of something she hadn't dared to believe she could feel again, a quiet confidence. It came not from certainty, but from acceptance. She didn't know how she would manage everything waiting for her, but she knew she would. Not because she was strong, though she was, but because she loved these children, all 3 of them, with a love that had grown through loss and hardship. And that love would guide her through the sleepless nights, the worries, the challenges. Before sleep fully claimed her, she whispered a promise into the dim room, a promise to her children, to her daughter, to the memory of Marcus, and to herself. They would be okay. They would face the world together. Their journey, unexpected, overwhelming, miraculous, was only beginning. If this story kept you watching until the end, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Share this video and tell others what you think. And don't forget to check out our other stories. You won't want to miss what comes next.